everyone. Oh, excuse me. This is Professor Gravett, and I'm here to talk to you about the second half of Persepolis, the story of a childhood, which is actually the first half of the full volume. There are actually 2 volumes of this, but we're only reading the first one. So apologies for the glasses. My skin has been acting up, so this is necessary. But apologies for the glare in the corner. But all right, so our agenda for the video today, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of a couple of the events in the novel. So the Iranian Revolution of 79 and the Iran-Iraq War shortly after. We're going to talk about it in the context of the graphic novel, do a little bit of a scene analysis. I'm going to discuss a couple of contemporary events that are happening in Iran currently, and then I'll talk you through the discussion post for this, for the second half of the novel. Okay, so the Iranian Revolution. So I got all of this from the reading that I assigned you on the Iranian Revolution. These are just a basic outline. Basically, one dynasty ruled from 1925 up until the revolution. There were a couple of things that happened, but basically this dynasty had adopted more Westernization and repealed some existing Islamic laws. They had some land reform and modernization programs, including giving women the right to vote. They also had outlawed the wearing of the hijab and the burqa. But when this newspaper published an article insulting a respected cleric, it angered a lot of people, and there were student protests all across the city of Qom. And then it led to sort of more demonstrations across the country and in Tehran. And sort of the narrative is that the people of Iran wanted to sort of reinstate their religion, right? That's the general narrative as we see from the book, from Persepolis. It's more complicated than that. Even though the Pahlavi dynasty adopted more Western practices and modernized some things, it was also a very cruel regime. Took a lot of political prisoners and was doing a lot of things that people were not happy with, as including sort of limiting religious practices. So, you know, while it was sort of, the narrative now is that it was a religious revolution, it also was much more complex and had many more elements, as we see from Persepolis. So the connections here, as we've been noting, in the earlier parts of the novel, Margie's father was taking photos of the many demonstrations held against the Shah's government. Their family often participated themselves. And as I was saying, Margie's story reveals that there are many reasons for protesting the Pahlavi dynasty, not just religion. Many were protesting against British influence of the Shah's regime. As we see through the novel, we see the sort of connections to colonialism and wars about oil, right, that sort of connect the U.S. as well. And the novel really presents the issues as more complex, as less sort of black and white, less just about, you know, we want to reinstate our religion, and more about protest against the regime as a whole. So the novel narrates the sort of movement from the revolution to the Iran-Iraq War, and sort of shows that the revolution did not turn out as many participants intended, and instead a stricter regime took over, which then instigated a border war with Iraq. And Persepolis, the narrative, suggests that the revolution was used by the regime as an excuse for the war, and Iran reinstated many religious laws, including compulsory wearing of the hijab, as we see in the narrative. So I'm just going to talk you through these 4 pages really quick. I'm going to read through them and we'll talk about how they connect. So this is right after Margie and her mom get in an argument. They're talking about the Iranian army retaking a city, and they're saying, even if it's true, what difference does it make to us? Margie goes to the basement, and she says, the basement was my hideaway. As it turned out, they did retake Khurram Shahir. We all thought that the war would finally end. In fact, Iraq proposed a settlement, and Saudi Arabia was willing to pay for reconstruction to restore peace to the area. But our government was against it. They declared, we refuse this imposed peace. We shall conquer the Shiite holy city in Iraq. Sorry, the camera's covering it up. Karbala, yes. So we plunged deeper into war. The walls were suddenly covered with belligerent slogans. The one that struck me most by its gory imagery was, quote, to die a martyr is to inject blood into the veins of society. They eventually admitted that the survival of the regime depended on the war. When I think we could have avoided it all, it just makes me sick. 1 million people would still be alive. Naturally, the regime became more repressive. In the name of that war, they exterminated the enemy within. Those who opposed the regime were systematically arrested and executed together. As for me, I sealed my act of rebellion against my mother's dictatorship by smoking the cigarette I'd stolen from my uncle 2 weeks earlier. Cough, cough. It was awful, but it was not the moment to give in. With this first cigarette, I kissed childhood goodbye. So in these 2 pages, in these 2 spreads, we see, we see Margie sort of figuring out that the sort of purpose of the new regime, the reasoning behind it, the connection to the war, and sort of the connection between anybody who was protesting the war and sort of herself, her own, coming into her own, right? Remember, this is a coming of age story. This is about her sort of figuring out her own boundaries, her own rebelliousness, and her own sort of understanding of the world. But doing so in this really sort of horrorscape, this terrible landscape of war and suffering and the complexities of that, right? Like how complex something like this really is, especially when it involves many different players, like not just the British, but the U.S., a number of political actors, the Soviet Union, a number of their allies, sort of funding these wars, right, for their resources, and then also what they're sort of putting their own people through. Okay, so that sort of brings me to the contemporary protests against the Islamic Republic that started with the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini by the sort of morality police in Iran. These protests continue. They started in fall of 2022. They continue. And they're really protesting the treatment of women, protesting the compulsory wearing of the veil, or sort of many women are burning their hijabs. Many people are sort of cutting their hair in public, and this is a huge danger. A lot of people have been arrested. A lot of people have been killed. But I think that this connects to the story because many of the things that Margie and her family were protesting that they were engaged with are still issues ongoing in Iran today. And it's still being influenced by the outside world in many ways. The U.S. has gone to war in Iraq several times over resources like oil, and has variously been allied with and against Iran. So I think it's an interesting contemporary context that shows that these issues are still really ongoing. Okay, so for your discussion post this week, let me take you over to D2L, and I will talk you through it. Sorry about this. Okay, here's content. We're on Week 3. Okay. So for your discussion post, I want you to think a little bit about how the histories of the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War that I went over very briefly in this presentation, but also that I've had you read about, impact your understanding of Persepolis. So I want you to think about that context and think about how it sort of enhances what you read and sort of what you see now that you finished the book and that you have gotten a little historical context about it. Yeah. So this is you performing historicist criticism. That's what that's called. So I want you to write a 250-word post on this that references specific moments in the text. And as always, respond to two of your peers as well. I'll add that to the post. So to close, this week again is more about historical context, more about thinking about what shapes the work and the actual sort of social landscapes that were shaping both the author and what they wrote about, and how that can really provide us insight into these texts, especially since we're looking at things from places that are really unfamiliar to us. It can really be helpful to get some of that context. All right. I hope you enjoyed Persepolis. I really like it. I think it's lovely. And I hope you learned something from it. And I will see you all again very shortly. Have a great week. Bye.